There's a phrase President Trump actually used to describe this part of the campaign. He called it Bridge Day. And before we get into what happened this week, I want you to sit with that for a second. Because whatever you think about this war, naming a military campaign against a country's bridges like it's a marketing event is the kind of detail that tells you something about the tone this conflict has taken on. I went through the CENTCOM releases, the reporting from outlets that have had people covering this war daily since February, an independent forensic investigation into one specific strike that a lot of people are still arguing about, and the legal analysis from people who actually study the laws of war for a living. So let's get into what's actually happened to Iran's bridges, because there's a real story here and it's more complicated, and in some places more troubling than a headline can capture. I'm not going to sensationalize the parts of this that are already disturbing enough on their own, and I'm also not going to flatten the parts that have a genuine defensible military logic behind them. You're getting the whole picture sourced piece by piece. You can draw your own conclusions from there. Let's start with this week, because that's presumably why you clicked on this. On Friday, July 17th, the United States expanded its air campaign against Iran, hitting more bridges, energy infrastructure, and a maritime control tower at a key Iranian port as part of an intensifying push tied to the standoff over the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM's own statement described the strikes as hitting Iranian air defense sites and military logistics infrastructure, aimed at pressuring Tehran to lift what the U.S. has called its chokehold on the strait. Iran's own account of the same strikes named 6 separate bridges in Hormozgan province, the province that sits right along that critical waterway, along with power infrastructure in the same region. Iranian state media reported at least 7 people killed and 20 wounded in that specific round, and Iranian health officials say the toll over just the past week across this whole expanded campaign has climbed to 38 killed and more than 400 wounded. The same overnight operation also appears to have taken down a maritime control tower at the port of Chabahar on Iran's Gulf of Oman coast, another major gateway tied to shipping through the strait. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth actually shared a photo of that tower collapsing on social media himself, which tells you this wasn't something the Pentagon was trying to downplay or keep quiet. It was something they wanted people to see, a deliberate show of capability aimed as much at Iranian decision-makers watching the news as at any specific tactical objective on the ground. That's worth noting on its own, because a lot of modern strike campaigns are conducted with an eye toward exactly that kind of visible signaling, not just the physical damage itself, but the message the damage sends. And a cabinet secretary personally posting footage of a collapsing structure is about as direct as that signaling gets. Iran responded within hours, launching missiles and drones at U.S. allies across the Gulf. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said it hit targets in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, and separately claimed an attack on a former U.S. outpost in Syria. Air defenses in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar reportedly intercepted the majority of what came at them, and Jordan said it fended off its own share of incoming fire too. Oil prices jumped 10% on the week as all of this unfolded, which gives you a sense of how directly this specific phase of the war is tied to global energy markets, not just the two countries actually exchanging fire. And it's a reminder that the audience for a strike like the one on the Chabahar Tower isn't only Tehran, it's every commodities trading desk and shipping insurer watching the strait in real time too. It helps to understand how we even got to a place where bridges became a named target category in the first place, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz back on February 28th, the same day the broader war with the U.S. and Israel began. And that single waterway carries something like a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas shipments on a normal day. The U.S. responded with a naval blockade on Iranian ports in mid-April, lifted it in mid-June after a ceasefire and a formal memorandum of understanding got signed, then reimposed it again in mid-July after that ceasefire collapsed over renewed Iranian attacks on commercial shipping. Trump's escalating threats against infrastructure, bridges, and power plants specifically have consistently been tied to the same underlying demand, that Iran reopen the strait to normal shipping traffic or face expanding consequences beyond purely military targets. So the bridge campaign isn't really a separate war on its own. It's one specific pressure lever inside a much bigger standoff over control of one of the most economically important waterways on the planet. And that context matters for understanding why a U.S. president would escalate toward hitting civilian-adjacent infrastructure at all, even if it doesn't settle the question of whether doing so is justified. Now, why bridges specifically? This is worth actually understanding rather than just accepting as a talking point from either side, because there's a real military logic underneath it, even if how that logic gets applied is where all the controversy lives. Bridges, especially the handful of major ones connecting Iran's interior to its southern coast near the strait, function as choke points for military logistics. Missile components, drone parts, fuel, troop movements, a lot of that has to physically cross specific river crossings and highway overpasses to get from manufacturing and storage sites inland out to the coastal areas where Iran has been staging its attacks on shipping and on you. S bases in the Gulf. Take out the right bridge, and in theory, you're not just inconveniencing traffic, you're cutting a specific supply artery that the military actually depends on. That's the argument S officials have made, more or less, for this entire campaign category, and it's worth knowing that it's also historically one of the oldest ideas in air power doctrine. Bridge interdiction campaigns go back to World War II, when Allied bombers spent enormous effort trying to sever German rail and road bridges to slow reinforcements heading toward the front. It got refined heavily during the Korean War and then again during Vietnam, most famously in the campaigns against the Ho Chi Minh Trail and against bridges like the Thanh Hoa Bridge in North Vietnam, a single crossing that American forces bombed repeatedly over years at real cost in aircraft and pilots, precisely because it kept getting rebuilt and kept mattering that much to North Vietnamese supply lines. Military historians still study that campaign specifically, because it showed both how effective and how genuinely difficult bridge interdiction can be against a determined adversary willing to keep repairing what gets hit. So there's nothing conceptually new about targeting bridges to choke off an enemy's supply lines, and it's a doctrine with a long, well-documented track record on both the successes and the costs involved. What's different here is the setting hitting infrastructure inside a country's populated interior, rather than along a remote jungle supply route running through mostly unpopulated terrain. And that's exactly where this gets complicated. Because the civilian population density around an urban Iranian bridge is nothing like the density around a jungle trail crossing in Southeast Asia. Because this isn't the first time a bridge has been hit in this war, and the first major one wasn't quiet or easily explained away as clean military logistics. Back on April 2nd, the United States struck the B-1 bridge in Karaj, a city just west of Tehran in the foothills of the Alborz Mountains. This wasn't some obscure river crossing. It was, at the time, described as the tallest bridge in the Middle East, a major, nearly finished engineering project connecting Tehran to western Iran, expected to open to the public soon. It was hit that day specifically because it happened to fall on Sizdah Baydar, an actual Iranian holiday, the 13th and final day of Nowruz celebrations, a day when families traditionally spend the whole day outdoors picnicking to close out the Persian New Year. Families were gathered in the area beneath and around that bridge for exactly that reason when the first missile hit. Here's where this specific strike became something a lot of independent investigators and legal experts started calling something more serious than a routine target. According to Iran's Fars news agency, and separately corroborated through video verification by the investigative outlet New Lines magazine, a second strike hit the same location after the first responders had already arrived to help the people wounded in the initial hit. That pattern, striking a target, waiting for rescuers to show up, then striking again, has a name in the laws of armed conflict. It's called a double-tap strike, and it's specifically flagged by humanitarian law experts as one of the more serious kinds of violations you can commit in a conflict, because it doesn't just risk civilian casualties from the original target, it specifically endangers the people whose entire job is to save lives in the aftermath. The forensic side of this is worth walking through in a bit more detail, because it's what elevates this from a disputed claim into something closer to an established fact pattern. New Lines magazine's investigation verified at least 7 separate munitions hitting the bridge across both strikes, cross-referencing multiple videos posted from different angles by people who were in the area at the time, an independent weapons specialist working with them, along with a former U.S. Air Force targeting officer who used to run civilian harm assessments at the Pentagon himself, both independently identified the weapons involved as consistent with 2,000-pound precision-guided bombs, the same class of munition, notably, used against much harder military targets elsewhere in this war, not exactly the kind of ordnance you'd typically reach for against an unfinished, not yet trafficked civilian overpass, if minimizing collateral damage were the actual priority. One video reviewed in that investigation shows a group of people sitting on a hillside near a tree with a visible picnic basket as smoke rises from the bridge after the first strike. And moments later, a second explosion hits the same area. A separate video, filmed from another angle entirely, shows a tent nearby and people running from the scene following that second impact. That kind of multi-angle, independently sourced verification is exactly the standard investigative journalists and legal analysts rely on when a strike's circumstances get formally disputed later. And it's a meaningfully higher bar of evidence than either government's own public statements alone. 8 people were killed in that strike. More than 95 were wounded. The deputy governor of Alborz province said publicly that the victims were ordinary families out celebrating the holiday, not military personnel or anyone connected to the logistics function the bridge supposedly served. And that's actually the second layer of controversy here, separate from the double-tap question entirely, because the bridge itself was still under construction. It hadn't opened to traffic yet, A U.S. official told the Wall Street Journal, according to reporting at the time, that the strike was meant to disrupt a route allegedly tied to missile and drone deployment. But that specific justification has been widely disputed, precisely because an unfinished bridge that the public couldn't even drive across yet is a strange thing to describe as an active supply route already in use. I want to be careful here, because I think there's a version of this story that gets told entirely from one side or the other, and neither version is honest. The U.S. military's position, consistently across this entire bridge campaign, is that these structures serve a genuine, definable military logistics function, tied to Iran's ability to keep striking shipping and regional bases, and that hitting them is a legitimate way to degrade that capability. Iran's position, and the position of a growing number of independent legal scholars, is that at least some of these strikes, the Karaj Bridge in particular, cross a line the laws of war are specifically designed to prevent targeting objects that are fundamentally civilian in character or use, and doing so in a way, the double tap pattern specifically, that shows an intent to harm rescuers rather than simply an unfortunate byproduct of hitting a military target. Legal experts have pointed specifically to the Geneva Convention's prohibition on destroying objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And some have drawn a direct comparison to a 2024 International Criminal Court indictment of 4 Russian military officials for systematically targeting Ukraine's power grid, a case that established real legal precedent for treating infrastructure attacks against a civilian population as potential war crimes, rather than just unfortunate wartime collateral damage. It's worth being precise about what that Geneva Convention's provision actually protects, because it's not a blanket ban on ever hitting anything with civilian use. It specifically targets objects whose destruction would leave a civilian population without the means of survival, food production and distribution systems, drinking water installations, and by extension, the transport links that keep those systems functioning, which is exactly the framing legal analysts have applied to a nearly finished highway bridge serving a metropolitan area the size of Greater Tehran. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, responded to the Karaj strike by calling it a sign of what he described as moral collapse and desperation, and said targeting incomplete, non-military infrastructure would never force Iran's population into submission. Whether or not you take an Iranian foreign minister's framing at face value, and there's obviously a propaganda incentive on his side of this too, the underlying facts of the strike itself, the timing on a family holiday, the unfinished state of the bridge, and the documented double tap pattern are independently verified by outlets with no stake in either government's messaging. And that's a meaningfully different situation than a straightforward military target getting hit during active combat operations. This is also, notably, part of a much bigger pattern in this specific war, not an isolated incident. Reporting from outlets tracking the broader campaign has documented strikes hitting Iranian universities, hospitals, schools, research centers, and pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities over the course of this conflict, alongside the bridges and power infrastructure. When Trump escalated his threats again in mid-July, ahead of a deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, he reportedly described the plan using that Bridge Day phrasing I opened with, threatening to unleash what he called hell on Iran's infrastructure if the deadline passed. Multiple experts quoted in that coverage said explicitly that a campaign structured around deliberately destroying civilian-use infrastructure as a pressure tactic, separate from any specific, provable military function each individual structure serves, would itself amount to a pattern of war crimes rather than a series of isolated, defensible military strikes. That's the strategic and legal tension sitting underneath everything that happened this week. When CENTCOM says its July strikes hit air defense sites and military logistics infrastructure, that's a real category of legitimate military target, and nobody seriously disputes that Iran has, in fact, used its road and bridge network to move military equipment during this war. But when the pattern also includes an unfinished, not yet opened civilian bridge hit twice in a row while rescuers were still on scene, on a day when Iranian families specifically gather outdoors by long-standing cultural tradition, that's a different kind of strike. And lumping every bridge hit in this war into one clean category, either all legitimate military logistics or all civilian atrocities, flattens a story that genuinely has both elements sitting inside it at the same time. There's also a bigger, largely unreported piece of this story that I think matters just as much as any single strike, which is exactly which bridges are actually sitting on the potential target list if this campaign keeps expanding. According to Iran's own bridge management system, the country has something like 300,000 bridges and technical structures nationwide, but only about 185 of them exceed 100 meters in length, and a mere 42 have a main span longer than 50 meters, meaning there's actually a fairly small, identifiable set of genuinely major bridges that would matter strategically or economically if they came down. Independent analysis has flagged 5 of them specifically as the ones carrying the most weight, And walking through what each one actually is tells you a lot about what's really at stake here beyond the word bridge as an abstract category. The Persian Gulf Bridge on Keshem Island in Hormuzgan province, right along the strait itself, has been a 50-year dream project for Iran, with ground broken back in 2011 and construction still sitting at somewhere around 15 to 18% complete. It's meant to eventually connect Keshem Island, which is believed to house an underground missile arsenal, to Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest mainland port. Even unfinished, its massive underwater foundations represent an investment of up to $700 million and sit at the center of a broader international trade corridor involving India and Russia. Then there's the Shahid Kalantari Bridge, crossing Lake Urmia in the northwest, a nearly two-decade construction project, finished in 2008, that cuts the driving distance between Tabriz and Urmia almost in half. Because it's suspended over an already ecologically fragile salt lake, destroying it wouldn't just cut off civilian travel. Experts have warned it could dump miles of steel and concrete into a lake that's already suffered one of the worst ecological collapses in the region over the past few decades. Inside Tehran itself, there's the Sadr multi-level expressway, an 11-kilometer structure supported by over 200 pillars, the 11th highest bridge in the world and the longest multi-level bridge anywhere in the Middle East, built entirely by Iranian engineers despite years of sanctions. Millions of ordinary commuters use it every single day. And any strike there risks not just direct casualties in one of the most densely populated stretches of the capital, but chaos in the city's entire emergency evacuation network. Further south, the Karun 4 Arch Bridge in Chaharmahal and Bakhtiari province sits directly over a major hydroelectric dam reservoir, meaning a strike there carries the added risk of secondary damage to the dam itself and potential flooding for communities downstream, well beyond whatever direct casualties the bridge strike alone would cause. And in Avaz, the center of Iran's oil and steel industries, the Gadir cable-stayed bridge spans the Karun River right through the heart of the city, the kind of structure that, if it came down, would effectively cut a major industrial city in half and choke off emergency services for a population that's already been repeatedly hit by strikes throughout this war. I'm walking you through those 5 specifically because I think it makes the abstract debate over infrastructure targeting a lot more concrete. This isn't a hypothetical question about some category called bridges in general. It's a small, specific, identifiable list of real structures, each with its own direct civilian population depending on it every day, and each one sitting on a list that's being discussed openly by military analysts and international observers as plausible future targets if this campaign keeps escalating the way it has so far. Iran's leadership has responded to the entire infrastructure campaign, bridges included, with a mix of defiance and threats of its own. After earlier rounds of strikes, Iran warned it would retaliate against the infrastructure of countries hosting U.S. forces in the region, and this week's retaliatory strikes against Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and reported attacks in Syria and Iraq's Kurdistan region show that threat wasn't empty rhetoric. At least 8 opposition fighters were reportedly killed in Iranian strikes inside Iraq's Kurdistan region this same week, according to a Kurdish Iranian opposition group tracking the fallout, which is a reminder that this war's bridge and infrastructure phase isn't just an American-Iranian exchange anymore, it's rippling out across multiple countries that never asked to be pulled into it. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Central Military Headquarters, its top overall military command body, issued a formal statement this same week warning that it would strike every remaining piece of regional infrastructure it can reach if its own infrastructure keeps getting hit, a direct symmetrical threat that suggests Iran sees this bridge and power plant campaign as something it intends to answer in kind, rather than simply absorb. That kind of tit-for-tat infrastructure threat is exactly what worries a lot of regional security analysts watching this conflict. Because escalation on this specific axis doesn't really have a natural ceiling the way a purely military exchange sometimes does. If both sides start treating civilian adjacent infrastructure as fair game whenever the other side hits theirs first, the list of potential targets only grows over time, pulling in countries and structures that had nothing to do with the original disputes over the Strait of Hormuz or Iran's nuclear program. Qatar, notably, has continued trying to play mediator between Washington and Tehran even while hosting U.S. forces that have themselves come under Iranian fire this week, which tells you something about how tangled the incentives have become for countries stuck geographically in the middle of this. So let's zoom back out to where things actually stand today, because that's really the heart of what this video is asking. There's also a straightforward economic angle worth understanding here too, separate from the direct military logic, and I'll come back to the full scale of it toward the end of this video. So here's where I actually land on all of this, and I want to be honest that this isn't a story with a clean, satisfying verdict at the end. The military logic behind targeting bridges tied to demonstrated logistics use isn't fabricated. It's a real, historically grounded piece of air power strategy. And there's a legitimate argument that degrading Iran's ability to move military hardware toward the coast has real strategic value in this specific fight over the Strait of Hormuz. But the Karaj Bridge strike specifically doesn't fit cleanly into that justification. And independent, non-government verification of the double tap pattern there is serious enough that I don't think it's honest to wave it away as just an unfortunate wartime mistake. And when the U.S. president is publicly using language like Bridge Day and threatening to bring a country back to what he's described as the Stone Age, that's not the language of a narrowly targeted logistics campaign. That's the language of an infrastructure punishment strategy. And multiple legal scholars have said exactly that framing itself raises the risk of the entire campaign crossing from legitimate military targeting into something the laws of war were specifically written to prevent. The international response has reflected exactly that split. European governments involved in monitoring this war have generally avoided directly endorsing the infrastructure campaign, with several officials repeating the same kind of proportionality concerns that came up earlier in this war over strikes on Iran's power grid. The idea that even genuine dual-use infrastructure, something that serves both civilian and military purposes at once, triggers real legal obligations to weigh civilian harm against military advantage before it gets targeted. Obligations that a blanket, deadline-driven ultimatum like Bridge Day doesn't appear designed to satisfy on a structure-by-structure basis. Independent human rights organizations that track this war have specifically flagged the Karaj strike as a candidate for formal investigation, citing exactly the kind of double-tap pattern and civilian holiday timing that shows up in war crimes prosecutions from other conflicts. And the comparison analysts keep drawing to the International Criminal Court's 2024 indictment of Russian officials over strikes on Ukraine's power grid isn't incidental. It's a direct signal that there's now real recent legal precedent for treating this exact category of infrastructure campaign as potentially prosecutable, not just diplomatically embarrassing. I think the honest way to hold this is that both things are true at once. Some bridge strikes in this war likely do hit real, functioning military supply routes, and there's a defensible case for those under the laws of armed conflict. And at least one strike, the one that's actually been independently investigated in the most detail, shows a documented pattern that a serious number of legal experts consider a war crime on its own terms, regardless of whatever justification gets attached to it after the fact. Painting this entire bridge campaign with one broad brush in either direction, either total legitimate military necessity or blanket war crimes across the board, isn't what the actual source-by-source evidence supports, and I'd rather leave you with that more complicated, less satisfying picture than hand you a clean narrative that the facts don't fully back up. It's also worth remembering that whatever legal verdict eventually gets attached to any of this, formally or informally, won't undo the underlying damage on the ground. Iran's own government has separately estimated total war damages across the whole conflict at something like $270 billion. A staggering figure for an economy the IMF projects will produce something like $300 billion in total output this year. Bridges aren't just military logistics routes in that calculation. They're also how a country actually functions day to day, moving food, fuel, medical supplies, and ordinary commuters. Every major bridge that comes down adds to that number in ways that go well beyond the immediate strike itself. Rerouting traffic for years, slowing emergency response times in future disasters, disrupting supply chains for ordinary goods long after the missile itself has already made headlines and faded from the news cycle. That's the kind of cost that rarely makes it into a single strike report. But it's very often the larger and more lasting part of the actual bill. I'll keep tracking how this specific piece of the war develops, especially whether there's ever a formal legal investigation into the Karaj strike specifically, because that's the case with the most independent documentation behind it, and it's the one most likely to actually set some kind of precedent for how the rest of this campaign gets judged once the shooting eventually stops. Wars like this one tend to get remembered later for a handful of specific moments rather than the full daily grind of strikes and counterstrikes. And if I had to guess which single incident from this entire infrastructure campaign ends up in that category, the Karaj Bridge is very much near the top of that list, precisely because it's the one with actual forensic video verification behind it, rather than just competing government statements. If breakdowns like this, the kind that actually sit with the uncomfortable, complicated parts of a story instead of picking the version that's easiest to package, are why you keep coming back here, go ahead and subscribe with notifications on. Because this war keeps producing exactly this kind of story, and I don't want you missing where it goes next. I'd rather you hear the version with all the actual sourcing attached than whatever gets stripped down to a 15-second clip somewhere else. And I want to hear your take on this one specifically, because I think it's genuinely one of the harder moral questions this war has produced. Where do you personally draw the line between legitimate military logistics targeting and infrastructure that should be off the table entirely? Does a documented double tap pattern change your read on a strike even if the underlying target had some military justification attached to it? Tell me in the comments, and let me know what other angle of this war you want me to dig into next, because a lot of what ends up in these videos starts right there in that conversation. That's where I'll leave this one. See you in the next video.